very good to see you all here on this wet morning. This is the very first installment of a new format that we're trying out called Foresight and Futures. The idea is that we will, throughout the year, invite foresight practitioners and people who have different ideas of futures and want to express them to people, and how those futures look when what they imagine have become commonplace. So yeah, follow us on newsletters and so on, and there's some 2 or 3 more presentations lined up already. This is also the start of the Vinterfesten day, and obviously when you have Vinterfesten in November, it's more gray than white, and however, it's Black Friday, so maybe gray is good compared to black, I don't know. We have a super interesting lecture coming up, and this lecture is also part of a project that we're doing called Create, Adapt, Sustain, that features courses and classes for more in-depth knowledge all around sort of digitization in different ways. So also keep an eye out of that. It's a project that we do together with the city of Malmö and the region of Skåne, funded by the European Union. Go Europe, right? And my name is Martin Törnqvist. I work at Media Evolution, where we're all situated, except for if you're watching this on the live stream, then you're also very welcome. And Media Evolution is a place for professional belonging, competence development, and collective broadening of horizons, and lifting of gazes beyond immediate deadlines. And so rooted in our collaborative foresight approach, this new series that we're launching aims to strengthen our ability to sense, imagine, and to learn to live with uncertainty. We see it as a conference all year long, and our vision is to link the different parts and together explore how foresight practices can enhance our capacity to future, bring hope, agency, and even a bit of optimism to our professional lives. And our collaborative foresight work builds on these 3 principles that I think is worth repeating over and over again. So we, and many with us, believe that futures are plural. It's not just one projected path that we can follow. It's different for different people, and it's also a very hopeful statement that we somehow can create our own paths and see our own futures. The future is also imagined, and we all have a sense of imagination. And if we allow ourselves to imagine more, we can also think about what those desirable futures are for us. And then last but not least, futures are also created. So first we imagine, and then we can take those imaginations into action in different ways. And we should all feel that we have an alibi to do so. And in this collaborative foresight work, we practice it in different ways. And the reason why it's called collaborative is that it builds on the fact that we're a community of hundreds of companies, thousands of people, that comes with lots of expertise and experience. So again, it's not like one person who is sort of head of future. Everybody is heading the future. And if we sort of think about futures together, our imaginations of what the future can become will be better and deeper. And in the spring, we did work under the umbrella "The Future is Here." And many of you were participating in workshops that were thinking about what regenerative futures for a professional neighborhood could be. So we're starting to use this language more and more to sort of think about, we have life, and a big part of that life is what we do for work. And how can we sort of take some of the wishes and desires that we have in our life and bring them to work life and to our professional life. And also like being situated in this specific area of Malmö that is, you know, packed with offices, the university. It's very much kind of a dull place if you think about it, and it's kind of hidden between glass and steel. What is produced is how can we sort of start to turn the insides out and to sort of show the work that we do and sort of energize each other in that. That was the thing with this project, and it also looked at different ways that workplaces can be regenerative and also work itself. And one of the results is this beautiful newspaper that features visions that we together imagined. There's also some quite practical sort of next steps. The newspaper is available by an installation that looks like that, by the entrance outside of the Futures library that we have over there. And this work was done in collaboration with Malmö Generate District and an organization that we followed and appreciated for a very long time called Dark Matter Labs. And that leads us to the speaker today. So Simon Höher is an independent strategy designer and a systems change lead at Dark Matter Labs. His work focuses on just transition processes, public innovation, and digital transformation. He has a background in sociology, political science, economics, and philosophy, with a particular focus on systems theory. And he has been working with public, private, and civic organizations for over a decade now. Currently, Simon supports the EU Commission's NetZeroCities mission in helping 100 cities transition to climate neutrality. Recent collaborations include work with UNDP, the World Economic Forum, and the African Center for Cities. We're very happy to have him here. Please give him a warm welcome. Welcome to the stage, Mr. Simon Höher.
Thank you so much.
And I'm your VJ, I forgot about that, sorry.
All right. Thank you so much for having me. I'll use that extra minute to restock on water. Yes. Yes. Perfect. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Let me see if this works. Not quite. Yeah. Hi, my name is Simon. I'm very happy to be here. Thanks so much for having me. To the team, as you already said, I'm working with a couple of hats. Most of my time these days, I work with an organization called Dark Matter Labs, and there most of my time I spend on a project where I work with the European Commission. I speak a little bit to this in a moment. This is work where we are one of many, many consortium partners in a huge so-called mission to help 100 cities in Europe transition to net zero climate emissions. As you can imagine, this is slightly ambitious. Another hat that I'm wearing is that I'm working a lot with civil society organizations in Germany and beyond, sometimes in the capacity Dark Matter, sometimes outside of that. And today I'll share a little bit, I think, about the questions that I come across working on and around futures. I think one of the main questions when I work on futures is a question that let me see if this works. It doesn't, which is fine. A question that I thought I would ask you first, asking you what these three things might have in common. This is a photo of the All African Peoples Conference in Ghana in the late 1950s, the first of its kind almost. It was part of this kind of continental endeavor for Pan-Africanism, part of the decolonial movement in the late 50s, head by Kwame Nkrumah and others. This is another one, not that long ago, just a few weeks ago. This is the Cúpula dos Povos, the the People's Conference at COP last month, a few weeks ago in Brazil. It's interesting. It's not the official COP. It's there was a People's Conference to it. I see nodding. You know what I'm talking about. And there's another one. I was hesitating a little bit putting those three things on one slide, but I feel there's something to it. This was last week. This happened in Berlin, and it was called the Summit on European Digital Sovereignty. I was hesitating because of the irony, because some of these things are directly influencing, not necessarily positively, one another. But my question was, what do these things have in common? And what do they have to do with futures? Any takers? Anything that comes to mind? Yes? Yes, for sure. It's kind of a conference collaboration session, yes? Interesting, yeah. Even, yeah. Which is slightly ironic. Is spot on. Sovereignty was basically the theme. I have my own problems with that word, so I went for self-determination. But that's exactly, I think that's really the underlying quest I feel when we talk about futures. This is about self-determination. This is about choosing our own kind of pathway, being able to make decisions, and I'll get back to this in a moment. And I think there are many, many, many more examples throughout history where we can look at, and people, I'm pretty sure in the late 50s, people didn't speak about speculative, positive, and desirable futures and forecasting and so on, but this underlying driver of willing and being able to chart your own future course. I think this is something that we find everywhere, and it's interesting because sometimes Europe's self-determination directly undermined those of other people's. So this is why I feel there's this at least tension in there. And obviously, just as many examples as we find in history for people trying to chart their own way into their future, usually many of these quests are leading to something that, interestingly, I think the US military more recently called an age of consequences. So many of the crises that we now, I think we now call them the poly crisis, the meta crisis, from climate catastrophes. Maybe someone still remembers. This is a while ago. Kind of already got taken over by so many other things that happened in the meantime. We have this kind of, and I like to call them dissonances, this kind of things where even though we plan for something else, other things come up. And we tend to treat that as obviously a flaw, a problem in the system. So we had our ideas for self-determination, sovereignty, our strategies to chart out futures, and then these things happen, almost like a side effect of what we actually wanted to do. We come up with borders and national sovereignty, and all of a second, the moment you invent the border or the boundary, you also, by accident, invent the border camp. I'm not sure anyone sat down on day one and said, let's come up with refugee or border camps, but that was kind of a necessary side effect. And this is, I think, the one thing that I wanted to take from this. These are not accidents outside of the ideas of self-determination. They are implicit in even the very first step of trying to go for a future. You kind of co-invent these other things along the way. So if dissonance is the problem, in many cases, I think one response to this dissonance of this is what we wanted to do, and then reality somehow bites back or fights back, is that we then turn to the future as something like a solution. Okay, we're experiencing these dissonances, these problems, maybe these intransparencies, and I get back to this as well. It's like we try to look for some pathway forwards towards some kind of self-determination, but it's so hard to chart that now we are stuck in this moment of past and present, and future, and we need to kind of disentangle this a little bit. And this is, I feel, where a lot of the kind of the promise of thinking about futures comes into play. Then we say, okay, if everything is so messy today, let's get together, let's come up with some kind of projections and outlooks and try to disentangle this on our way forward. And then we find a lot of the, I would say, the ideas about kind of making futures, and usually this leads, or not usually, but sometimes this leads to a couple of, I would say, responses that I at least would invite us to quickly reflect upon a little bit. Like the first one is, once we talk about futures, we talk about predictions in many cases. This is the stock market, which is kind of a whole world that is based on not just predictions, but it's basically based on the predictions of others. So you get this layered versions of trying to forecast how others are forecasting, and then arbitrage kind of your maybe a slight advantage of information or just a hunch or something. Sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. But you have this world of predictions. If you take one step further, from predictions you can talk about prevention. Coming back to COP, or generally the theme of climate catastrophes or changes. This is a photo from the Extinction Rebellion protest. It says 12 years to save the Earth. I'm not entirely sure when this was taken. I'm not sure we still have 12 years left. But the idea here is not only did we do a prediction, not only did we do a forecast, now we can translate these insights into reality of today. And now we can prevent a future from happening. Now we have to get together. So this is also tied into this threat of self-determination, which is kind of coming out of a predicted future. And then there's a pretty problematic version of this, which is preemption. This is George Bush in 22 at West Point, where he gave a speech, and I quote, "If we wait for threats to fully materialize, we'll have waited too long. We must take the battle to the enemy, disrupt his plans, and confront the worst threats before they even emerge. In the world we have entered, the only path to safety is the path to action. This nation will act." This isn't even prediction or prevention anymore. This is preemption. This is trying to avoid a future from happening before that future is somehow coming back to you. And in this case, and I took this, it has deadly consequences. This is your projection coming back, not to haunt yourself, but to haunt others. And I feel this kind of prediction, prevention, preemption logic is something that it's, especially the last one, is maybe something that we co-invent when we talk about the future as well. There is always the option for preempting and thereby inflicting costs on others by the futures that we come up with. So dissonance is the problem, and futures are the solution. And just to kind of illustrate this a little bit, how this looks like, we all know. Also, a long time ago, some of you remember the pandemic. I remember dashboards that constantly predicted collectively how things will pan out. When are we expecting a peak, and how should this translate into present-day actions? The same, even more prominently, probably these days, are predictions by the IPCC. What scenarios for climate transitions or catastrophes or changes are feasible, are we going to look for? How can we work around this? As I said earlier, the work with the European Commission, it's basically the whole mission is based on something like there's a dissonance in the present, and we have to work through a more coherent future that allows for self-determination. There are many others. I'm not sure if anyone recognizes these three beautiful gentlemen. This is Fisher Black, Myron Scholes, and Robert Merton. They invented something that's called the Black-Scholes formula. This is the cornerstone of option trading and finance, invented in the 70s, or presented in the 70s. It's basically allowing, or it offered traders to calculate the risk of options that we're trading. So they brought in a future that was kind of dissonant and intransparent into a present where you can literally put that formula. And as you can see with that formula, it's quite complex. So they also made it necessary to really bring in the computer, the electronic calculator in options trading in order to be able to work with futures, predicted futures, and kind of arbitrage your advantage. The fun thing is, obviously, it was a public formula, so now everyone was using a formula. So again, you have this kind of performativity of the model. Once everyone uses the model, well, how much is the model really representing reality? How much is it making reality? There are many other predictions these days. Probably the biggest one that we all are facing these days are predictions about AI and like AGI, general intelligence, and AI taking over the world. This is one of many, many websites. If you look at this, it's very interesting. It's not only highlighting that obviously the impact will be greater than anything we've ever seen before from the Industrial Revolution and beyond. It's also very interesting because it gives somehow credibility. Like the people who wrote this, they are certified forecasters and futures professionals. So we try to, again, resolve the dissonance, the intransparency of the future in some kind of credibility in the past. And if we only know what's going to happen, then we can act accordingly. There are all kinds of methodologies attached to this. There are charts. This is this is a chart by the Bureau of Economic Analysis, United Nations. Sorry, it's the Federal Reserve Bank, Federal Reserve Bank of the US, but the data is from the United Nations. And it's basically projecting GDP based on development of AI, and there are like 3 scenarios. Everything goes as planned. This is a logarithmic scale. There's super intelligence and everything will skyrocket, and there's super intelligence and everything will die. So, okay. Thanks, I guess. So this is not to say this is all pointless or anything. It's just to say we have to understand what we're co-inventing when we invent the future, so to speak. And it can become problematic, not only because sometimes these predictions kind of loop back on the present. This is obviously one of the big worlds of predictions is elections, polls. It gets problematic because there's something that we sometimes overlook. And there might be a problem with this. This guy is Henri Christophe. He is a revolutionary. He was the first black king of Haiti in the early 19th century. After the Haitian revolutions in like the late 18th century until about 1804, he was the first head of a state. And the Haitian revolution, I think it's very hard to overestimate how and I'll come to this, how unthinkable, how thoroughly amazing it was. It's been the first and the largest slave uprising since Spartacus, about 2,000 years before that. It's been one of the very few cases where such an uprising not only led to the victory of the formerly enslaved, but also to the establishment of an actual nation, which is then, they had a black king. They built something that I'm going to show. They built something that they call sans souci, literally, taking some inspiration from Germany or Prussia. Installed that black king on this castle in the jungle, which had running water, marbles, chandeliers, and a whole kind of court of hundreds of people working in this. This was an actual monarchy from like previous slaves somewhere on a former colony. There are many things that are extremely remarkable about this. This guy, Henri Christophe, he used to be a bricklayer and a cook's apprentice and then turned king. But one of the things that I wanted to highlight and why I brought this is with all the predictions and all the preventions and the modeling and the forecasting, there will always be things and events that are generally outside anything that we can even fathom. And I said this earlier, the most radical futures that we can think about are genuinely unthinkable. And I mean this in the literal sense. We cannot think them. There's no way for us to fathom how this would look like. And to take this example, before this revolution happened, there are actually letters by the French that send home just like letters to their family or loved ones in France, just a few days before this all came apart. Everything is quiet here, no need to worry, you should actually come over and visit, everything is perfectly fine. So it was unthinkable before it happened, not just to the French, even to the revolutionaries, it was not really thinkable what is going on here. To the historians who, if you look at the records, no one was able to conceive of the impact of what was happening before it happened. While it was happening, it was unclear what's going on. It felt like, okay, this is, I mean, it has been 2,000 years since Spartacus, so no one understood what's going on here. And interestingly, after it happened, that was still the case. It took another 100 or even 150 years or so for black intellectuals, especially in the US, W.E. Du Bois and others, to dig through the archives. And this is actually, and we briefly spoke about this book, there's a great historian called Michel Rolf Trouillot who really did the work on understanding what took place here, to make that history and rediscover it and be even able to tell the story, because it wasn't just thinkable before it happened, and while it happened, it was also unthinkable after it happened. There was a future and a present and a history that no one was able to think. And only now we can look back at it and rediscover a future that was there. And I think that is something that is really, it's literally outside of anything that we can plan for or optimize for when we come to our predictions and plans. And this is actually what I wanted to kind of maybe bring into this conversation. What do we do with the most radical futures? And I would say sometimes we really need those radical futures to get out of where we are today, if you think about the many dissonances that I mentioned earlier. How can we go about this? How do you design for a future that you know you cannot think, no matter how hard you try, because you always are thinking from where you are? It's a hard thing to do. It's also pointing us to the kind of the flaws or the challenges that come up when we try to do it. And I'm just highlighting a few things that I think this example of Haiti highlights when we look at the futures and at the ideas of futures that we have. Just a few examples. The first kind of challenge with the futures that we are bound to think about is coherence. There's an interesting word in German which is called Leitbild, which is untranslatable to anything else. It's one of those connected German words. Light comes from guidance. Build is image, so it's kind of a guiding image. And it's used often in planning, in urban planning, in political planning. What is our light build? What is our kind of imaginary, you could say, that we want to draw upon in order to get, again, some coherence, some kind of orientation. What are we aiming towards? And then you kind of can flesh out this light build, this scenario, you can say. And obviously there are other versions, but in many cases you end up with something like this kind of classical examples, the dystopian tech future, the growing green future of eco-villages, something somewhere in between, but you get these images, and the very point of an image is that it is coherent, that it gives you an idea on what to expect, which already, if you look at the world, is problematic because we don't live in a coherent world. Reality is never coherent. We cannot make an image of the present that we currently live in. So the second we come up with a scenario, obviously, we will have to select for things that will be in the frame of the image and things that will be outside of the frame of the image. There's a great Swiss urban sociologist, Lucius Burckhardt, or was, who kind of really dug into like what happens if we think about scenarios and light builder and this kind of imaginaries and bring them into our political and our kind of corporate planning processes. The first thing is kind of, as I said earlier, we kind of take ourselves the ability to work with dissonance because we always have this kind of imaginaries, sure, we can have more than one image, but still we will never have the complexity, obviously, of reality in there. The second problem that comes with these kind of imaginaries is who gets to draw them. This is a democracy problem if you think in public imaginaries, but also in a corporate setting. The question is who gets to draw them and who gets not to draw them. We all know, I think we, to some extent, we're all living in the light build, in the imaginary of Sam Altman these days. Like, there's a lot of power with being able to draw an image, and there's a power dynamic with not being able to counter that. It gives this kind of idea of objectivity. Well, we agreed upon this is where we want to go to, and that means we can derive a couple of things that we do in order to get there. And I get to this kind of understanding of causality or linear causality. If only we do this, then we might get to this imaginary, and that might be a little bit problematic. And then the final point that Burkhard makes that I mentioned earlier, there's this performativity. Like, sometimes it's intended. If we only draw this image, then maybe it becomes this kind of self-enforcing dynamic. But to come back to Sam Altman, I'm not sure we all agreed for a self-reinforcing dynamic of AI, business, opportunities, and world making that we are witnessing now. Friederike Kaltheuner, who is an expert on AI and tech and regulation, I think just a few days ago mentioned in the European Parliament in a hearing that what we're getting into now is that AI is becoming, again, too big to fail. So we're drawing an image that we cannot afford to not materialize, whatever the cost, literally the cost. It's billions that states now invest into an imaginary where it's very questionable how democratic that was in terms of how it was shaped. So we have this problem of coherence and difference and democracy. There's another problem that comes with thinking about futures, which is, if we come back to this is another version of the future cone. I like this one because it charts different paths for potential futures. And it also gives you some kind of idea of resilience. Like, sometimes it's easier to switch these paths, and sometimes it's obviously way harder. The interesting part about this is that I think in many cases we have these projections of future pathways, and then we say, well, if we're here, this is not as desirable, so we want to go further up. So this is what we're actually trying to aim for whenever we talk about futures. Understand what path are we currently on, and then kind of shift towards what part do we actually want to get on. So there's always this kind of shift from to. So we have maybe a present and a future trajectory, some kind of non-desirable or desirable logic of this. And again, this is not a bad thing. It's just it's a co-invention when we talk about futures in time, that we have this from to binary, and there are actually examples on how this can really be extremely powerful and helpful. This is work by Superflux. They called this the More Than Human Manifesto, and trying to rethink how we not just go about futures, but also how we go about design work, about planning, from shifting always from planning to gardening, from certainty to contingency, from also the understanding of how we go about the world, from fixing to caring, and they actually unpack all of these binaries. It's beautiful work. I can strongly recommend. But for better or worse, it keeps us in this binary of from and to, if we talk about futures, and it gives us this logic of a binary that has something in its frame, and keeps us from seeing what is outside of that frame. And it's a bit interesting, I would say, to explain, because there's something, maybe that's the easiest way to explain this is a little story that Michel Serres wrote about in his interesting book called The Parasite. The story is that there's a land rat from the countryside that visits his friend, the city rat, who lives in the city. And the city rat lives in the house of a tax collector. And the country or the land rat comes to visit, and they have dinner. They basically have dinner at the leftovers of the tax collector. Very nice, have a great dinner of leftovers, and then they hear a sound outside, and then they disperse. And Sarah unpacks this and says, okay, if we think about what's inside and what's outside of the frame, how can we think about who's the parasite here? Like who's sitting outside of the thing that we see? And what does it tell us about the dynamics of what we focus on and what we do not focus on? Because if you unpack this, the question is, well, is the city rat just the parasite to the tax collector? Is the land rat the parasite to the city rat? Are all of them just parasites on society, if you look at the tax collector? There's always something that you focus on, and then there's always something sitting outside of your frame. And this, what is sitting outside of the frame, what usually just goes unnoticed. It's kind of the noise in between the signals that we see. This is what Sarah's called the parasite. It's feeding off the channel. Sometimes it makes for some disturbances, like a clicking in the telephone connection, but you cannot really put your finger on it until you switch your frame again. But then other things kind of get out, lost in the noise again. And I think the part that I find interesting when we think about parasites and futures is, if we look at this from to, what are the rats, what are the parasites that are sitting outside of our binaries if we think from and to? If you think of this kind of pathways, what is not even in the picture, but also emerging and also already happening? And these types, I'm not sure if there's even futures. In another context, we spoke about somewhere in between signal and noise, and we called it nuisance, like this kind of a little bit of annoying. It's not yet a signal. It's also not something that you completely discard. So what is sitting in outside of your frames that we can call maybe parasitic futures that are thriving off our binaries that we put elsewhere? And the final one is this guy again. Sorry. Because I said earlier, the frames that we draw, they are a function of power. They're a function of power dynamics and the question of who gets to draw these frames of what we even conceive as being possible. By just a little bit of context again for this Haitian revolution, it also took place during the Napoleon Wars, and France was kind of bogged up with many other conflicts at the same time. So you could even make the argument that this whole revolution was sitting outside of the frame of reference of France at that given time, and therefore it was even able to thrive. So Michel Trouillot, who I already mentioned, Michel Rolf Trouillot, who wrote this, this is in a book called Silencing the Past. So it's a book about history and the past, not necessarily a book about the future. But it's interesting because he highlights versions of silencing and thereby kind of pushing outside of our frames of references what we see when we look for futures. And I just wanted to bring these. There are 4 versions of this. You can silence and you can push things out of frame at the moment of creation. So you basically don't even account for given sources of who's going to be part of your conversation about the future. There's a silencing at the moment of assembly. Well, maybe you've been part of this hearing, participative workshop, election, but then it just doesn't get recorded. It doesn't get assembled and doesn't make it to the archives of the futures and the past that we talk about. There's a silencing at the moment of retrieval. Well, maybe you said it, maybe it made it to the archives or the documentation of our workshop, but then it sits there forever, and then we just go on elsewhere in our C-suite, in our political discourses. And as you can imagine, this has a strong effect on the narratives that we even make. And then the final one is a silencing in the moment of basically attributing significance. Well, maybe we recorded it, maybe it made it to the archives, maybe we even retrieved it, but then we discard it because, yeah, that's interesting, but it doesn't really matter for now. These are functions of power. Future making is power. It's not a form of power. This is the essence of power. It's making a world and a time that we perceive as real. And I think, if anything, Henri Christophe shows us that that can come back to bite us, at least if we're the French. So let me finish soon with a little bit of maybe flipping this a little bit around. So we started off with dissonance is a problem, futures are the solution. because they help us to make sense of the world, and we can come up with some future coherence strategy to bring it back to the present. And this gives us this kind of future cone looking to the future. But what if you flip this around? And we said, well, what if futures are the problem and dissonance is the solution? What if the fact that we have to think about time and future as something that we cannot really predict, but that we are making and remaking over and over again, is the problem to which dissonance is the actual solution, because this dissonance allows us to actually make choices. Now, bear with me for a second. I find this extremely interesting, but also it's a little bit hard to wrap your head around. There's a cybernetician called Heinz von Förster who said that the only decisions that you can ever make are those that are actually undecidable. The only decisions you ever can make are only the decisions that are in principle undecidable. So what did he mean by this? And it links directly to what we were saying in the very beginning of self-determination. If there's a decision that is decidable, and he's a physicist, so his examples are, I don't know, how many zeros does the number 7,000 have? Or you have a math calculation. But you can translate it to public administration, to business scenarios, basically everywhere where we have a principle, a guiding principle that says, well, if this, then that. That's not a decision to be made. That's a decision that is already decided. There's nothing for you to decide here. This is not a decision, and it's certainly not self-determination. The point is that only those decisions or only those questions that are in principle undecidable, what was the beginning of the earth, what is life worth living for, all these usually ethical questions where you can't look up the right answer in a dictionary, in a definition, in a previously made decision in your company board, these are the ones where self-determination actually lies. Self-determination, freedom or sovereignty happens where there is in principle an undecidable decision to be made. This is a version about future that I think now is dissonant and a solution, because now in this undecidability, and there's this beautiful quote, the opposite of determination isn't chaos, the opposite of determination is choice. This is where we become human, and this is where we actually can thrive for self-determination. And it goes both ways. So it's deciding. Actually deciding is the exception. Most of the time, in most of our contexts, we're not deciding, we're implementing a previous decision. And it goes the other way, because most of the time, when we think about the past, we are not remembering, but we are forgetting. So this intransparency of time, it goes both ways. It goes into the future. We cannot predict the future because we don't know exactly what decisions are going to be made, because they are generally undecidable. But it also goes into the past because we cannot fully remember the past. And the reason for that is we don't know what we forgot. That's the whole point of history. And that's the whole point, by the way, of the book by Michel Rolf-Trouillot. You don't see what you don't see. You don't remember what you forgot. And so this is, you can also call this the memory function. And the main job of the memory function basically is to keep forgetting and rejecting things that happen in order for you to be able to move, right? If you remembered everything as a system, as an organization, as a society, that would be just overload or stagnation. So the core function of the past is to decide what to remember and what to forget. And 99% of the time, everything qualifies as noise, because we discard, we have to stabilize the many, many kind of rules, decisions that we made earlier. And in between these two sides, in between kind of an indeterminate, undecidable future and a forgettable past, this is where the present happens. And this, I think, is where responsible design takes place. Because then, to put it kind of blatantly, we have to forget in order to learn. We have to discard the many things that we have now, or at least kind of question them in order to learn new things. And we have to refuse in order to decide. We have to refuse decisions that have been made earlier and able to kind of unlock them again, to make them decidable again. So to design responsibly means to design for dissonance. And I'm almost done. I just wanted to highlight, because this is super abstract, how does it look like in practice, how can this be done in worlds that are not very kind of meta conversations on a Friday morning, but somewhere out there in the real world. So I brought some examples from actually my work, our work, and work of people that I really find very inspiring. The first one is option spaces. So we call this portfolio work, but the logic is basically saying, how can we move away from making single point interventions and single point solutions? You remember this, like shifting the pathway from this one to this one if we only do this. How can we move away from this one towards something that is generally more geared towards opening option spaces? And the first step is to think in portfolios, and this is what is happening in NetZeroCities today. I show a screenshot of this. To not say, well, to get to net zero, this is the one thing that we do. The second thing is, to go to net zero, these are the list of things that we do. It's kind of a portfolio of actions, and I've read many of these so-called climate city contracts, which all of these cities have to write. And it's basically, in many cases, a long list of many, many interventions, sometimes up to 200 interventions or even more. Everything from energy transition, the built environment, nature-based solutions, and so on. And I think the real art now is to move to something that looks something like this. It's not just a list of different actions, but it's understanding that these actions are somehow interconnected, and you have these interdependencies, and you also take a new role from a classical designer or a planner to something that we then call an orchestrator, or if you remember this, even a gardener. So you put in, and I get to this, conditions that make it more likely for an entire system to self-organize towards something that you would like to see by giving it back the choice, the freedom to self-determine. So it's kind of opening up option spaces, bringing in potentiality for decision-making in order for everyone to be able to self-determine towards a shared trajectory. This is how it looks like in practice. This is a colleague of mine that did this, I think even with the city of Lund, and a few other Norwegian cities and Swedish cities. This is a screenshot of their portfolio. So basically all these little things that you see here are categories and then actions. And the idea here is, I think it's a bit of a shame, because the most important part of this are the connections in between those things. It's trying to understand how are these things interconnected, and if we do this, what else do we have to account for? And also, by the way, not just us, but also other actors in the ecosystem. How can we understand our ecosystem like a network of concerted action rather than a long list of things, that a to-do list that we have to govern? I'm speeding up a little bit. This is another project that you probably know very well. M0, this is another colleague of mine, also worked by Dark Matter Labs, by Ivana. The idea here is to say, okay, instead of predicting an entire future, what if we focus on this one only? And we see what the system does with this. And we have this kind of cascading, trickle-down effects. And for each layer here, again, we bring in freedom of decision-making. We bring in self-determination, but we hope for unlocking what really trickles down. So the question here is, outside, out of the many, many potential things that we do, which are the things that most likely trigger future action, reaction by others? If you think about, again, about those two sides of decidable questions and things that we maybe need to learn or forget, how can we identify this kind of catalysts, this kind of initial interventions which trickle down through a system? In this case, it's about what would happen if we had a building stop. There's 0 new buildings being allowed to build. What would happen to a system as a trickle down or cascading effect then? Another kind of, this is not an exhaustive list on how to do this. This is just, I would say, entry points on how to think about this. Coming back to Lucius Burkhardt, he frames this, the minimal intervention. Well, if you want to keep a future open and responsible thereby, because you keep self-determination to people and to systems, that would mean that whatever you do should be the minimal intervention of doing something. So this is the walking strategy of the city of Trondheim. They did many, many things, but among those things, what they also ask themselves is, how can we get more people to walk? And one thing, in addition to, I don't know, abandoning cars, zoning specific areas where you can go by car or anything else, one thing that they did is just they put more benches in the city. So it was a very tiny intervention, but it shifted something that, and I get to this, we could call an enabling condition, or the condition that made it possible for other actors to then behave differently with very little cost. And that is kind of the crux here. It's the cost for you or for others for an intervention. And I think maybe not so much here, definitely in Germany, if you look outside of the window, that in many cases, if you look at urban planning, was the opposite of a minimal intervention. We now live in the concrete dreams of the 60s, and it's incredibly costly to move away again from a future that has long passed, that's 70 years ago, but we're all stuck in now. So what's the minimal intervention to bring in your future rather than the maximal one? And the final one, I mentioned this, are enabling conditions. I go about this very quickly because I think we're done almost. You can ask yourself, what are interventions, again, that you can bring in where others can build upon? So the prototype fund, it's been going for a long time in Germany and in Switzerland as well. It's basically saying, well, we unlock funding opportunities, in this case for public interest tech from a broader community, but we take away a lot of the strings and the hurdles that you usually need to overcome in order to get funding, and let's see what happens. That's basically the premise. Let's see what the community builds out of something where we give a little bit of a constraint and a little bit of an enabling condition, and then some things grow out of these. There are many others. Europe Talks is another intervention that tries to match people from very different parts of a political spectrum to see what happens when we bring them together. There are spaces. This one is Chimurenga in Cape Town, South Africa. The point here is, what can you put in place for the system to do its thing rather than to plan and predict and prevent an entire future that's happening? I skip about through this a little bit because I think we're done here. Final thing I wanted to say about this is it also has to do with increasing your capacity to sense and to make legible what is happening. This is a project called the Cornerstone Indicators, asking you what are the things that we actually have to observe and see about the present in order to unlock a more interesting future. Cornerstone indicators are basically asking, what do we measure in a city? Maybe we measure how many 14-year-old girls go to school by bike every morning. And that's an indicator that's maybe way more telling than a GDP of a neighborhood. Skip over this, and I finish coming back to Haiti again, and asking this big question of designing responsible futures. I found this quote that I really like. When we refuse, we create dissonance. And more importantly, we allow dissonance to continue. It's by the book Undercommons by Stefano Hani and Fred Morton, more recent book. And I think this is what it comes down to. It's not so much about creating coherent futures and predictions and plans. It's about creating dissonance that bring back undecidable decisions for others to thrive upon. That's it from me. Thank you so much for bearing.
Thank you very much, Simon. And the thing is, it's almost 10, so we're almost out of time. So, and that means that everybody's free to leave. However, I think we could also, for those that have some more time, you can also stay, and we can have a Q&A, and then there's time for more conversations afterwards as well. Does anybody have an immediate question, or I start?
Yes.
There wasn't a question, then I don't have to.
Awesome.
Hold on, we have a microphone.
Oh.
That Frida my colleague, is coming with.
So I wasn't going to ask anything, but since I happen to come from Trondheim, I wanted to cause some pain in your life.
I met with them just yesterday. So
yeah, first of all, thank you for a great introduction.
Thanks.
And my question is, you're kind of playing around with these three pairs of words. You have the dissonance, you have the silence, or I would rather call it silencing, and I think it's a difference, and futures. And you suggest one being the problem and one being the solution and flipping them around. So if the futures is a solution and a dissonance is a problem, as opposed to the other way around. What about the third alternative? So if you're in the business of silencing, the futures will always be a challenge, right? And I'm not sure that dissonancing is always a question of choice. It's also a question of overwhelming communities.
Mm-hmm.
And if you look at these contracts that I happen to have read for Trondheim, they're about 600 to 800 pages long. And I can tell you no politician in Trondheim has ever read these contracts. And they are now getting EU financing to implement measures that they don't understand. So are you also not kind of creating a third alternative, which is the perpetuation of silencing through the means of dissonance to make people too tired to question that future that you're trying to design?
Absolutely, yeah. I think that's I can only agree, and I have read many of these documents. It's anywhere between 100 to 200 pages, and I think I fully agree, and I think it's problematic. It's problematic because this legibility part that I mentioned, it doesn't just go what's legible for our institutions. It also goes what's legible for us as citizens. And we find, especially with the European Commission, I dare say, many things that are not really legible. Oh, you do? So I completely agree. I think this is not, this goes both ways. And I think that kind of power creeping in, obfuscation, dissonance, illegibility, it's not always just beautiful and great. First of all, it's dissonance, and you're right to kind of highlight this. First of all, it's like it's making sure, well, things don't quite make sense, and it's hard for people to engage, and it's hard for people to overcome this. So I fully agree with you. So I don't think that's the solution is to say, well, let's just make a master plan that kind of tries to get it all right and then also open up some doors for dissonance. I think what you're saying is completely spot on. I think the task, or this is why I said the art really is to find a balance where we don't go into dissonance that equals chaos or just like noise. And we also don't kind of over pretend some clarity or coherence where we know that's not going to represent reality. So finding this balance and refining it, I feel, is probably more what this is about. Yeah. No, it's a good kind of emphasis. I think it's important. Any other questions? Or doesn't have to be a question, can also just be a...
Thank you for a great presentation, and I think I'm perhaps this question is chasing understanding of what you build into to dissonance in a way. I'm interested in I think the Haiti analogy is interesting because I mean if we talk about futures as being multiple, the present is also clearly multiple, and the sort of framing of this conversation kind of assumes that there's a limited amount of agents shaping this future, whereas in fact, if we could broaden the amount of agents in, I mean, the future is iterative and it's collectively iterative, right? So if there had been the people in Haiti would have had access to each other's visions, perhaps it would have been clear that this would be happening in a few days, because they would be aware of the drives that were carried within the population in reaction to the French oppression, right? So perhaps the future task, we're assuming that I mean the futures and the stories have power in that they provide guidance for us, but perhaps the process is also to generate iterative platforms where we access so that the frame broadens, right?
Yeah.
And so I mean, so those are two kind of, I'd just like to hear your thoughts between that gap, between like creating these futures so that we have something to pursue, but also how do we act to broaden the iterative processes that that build that future and inform us about the process from the present to the future.
A quote comes to mind by Alfred North Whitehead: "Seek for simplicity, but distrust it." I think that for me, when I saw it on a postcard once, but I feel that that's really, it's the paradox. And I think in many of these kind of systems, kind of logics, they all hinge on some kind of paradox. And the paradox is the value, the dissonance is the value. The value doesn't lay in finally resolving it. The productive part of it is both is true. You seek for the simplicity, you seek for the narrative, the story that organizes action. And while you do that, you distrust it. You know, the closer you get, the more hesitant you get with actually what you're getting there. So I think it's both of these things. And I think if you have this kind of this distrust version, in another context, we wrote a paper once which was called Designing Doubts. So it's designing and the doubt is in there. So I think that's maybe one way to make that paradox more productive rather than being just dumbfounded and be like, okay, what do we even do? Well, you do both. You aim for the one thing and you kind of constantly undermine it while you do it. That would be my answer.
One more question and then we get on with the day. No?
Yeah.
Yes. Always needs to be at least 3, right?
Of course. Or 5.
Thank you so much for the presentation and for bringing up the question of power. And I was curious, in the examples you highlighted, can you give us any tips on how we broaden and make those consultations or those design processes inclusive?
Yeah. There's another paradox there that comes to mind. This is Lucius Burkhardt again. I can't really quote it, but the point is, so he talks about participative events that the city, like this hearings, like the city invites citizens to say, hey, come around Tuesday night, 6 p.m., we share our plans, and then you get to share your opinions on our plans. And I think what he says is something to the extent of, the more you aim for coordinated participation, the more you undermine actual emancipation. Which is basically saying, if you ask as a city, citizens to come by on Tuesday evening at 6 p.m. and then share their thoughts at 6:30 and put it in this mailbox and then wait for a response, that's the exact opposite of emancipation. Probably true participation, emancipation would be them standing in front of the city hall on a Monday morning, blocking the entrance or whatever it is. So I feel that again, it's not to be resolved in one side or another, but I feel there's this tension in between how much can you plan for participation, invite people to come in at a given point in time, share their thoughts in a given format, and then work with this. And on the other hand, to what extent is it not them that need to come, but is it you that need to leave? Leave where you currently are and find them and see, is participation something that can only happen in your city hall at Tuesday evening, or is it already happening in a neighborhood? And it's just for you, obviously not you, but it's just for you as an institution to see it, to register it, to learn how to work with the participation and the engagement that is already taking place in formal networks, I don't know, gatherings in a neighborhood, community work that is already sitting outside of maybe your frame. And then maybe participation is not so much about making an event, but it's about leaving your office and talking to people that are already making the city. I'm working a lot with cities, so this is why I'm talking about cities all the time, as it is today. So we call this distributed governance, because it takes away the center of governance from, say, one municipality or one CEO or wherever you have it, and acknowledges the fact that it is already taking place. It's not a prescriptive thing. What can we do to kind of encourage more people to co-govern the city? It's a descriptive thing. It's already taking place. We just have to learn how to see it and to account for it. Thank you. Thanks again for having me. I hope that wasn't too heavy for a Friday morning.
It's very philosophical, and it's exactly what we need.
Okay.
There's this reminder to stay in the spaces in between things, and I got to think about how beautiful music comes into place when knowing what notes not to play.
Yeah.
So thank you very much for this. And you're all welcome back later today. The restaurant is open, the lunch is great. At 1 p.m. We do a community horizon, which has been a call to member organizations of Media Evolutions to come and share changes and signals that are currently affecting them and futures that they want to see happening. So we're going to do a sort of marathon-esque relay of 12 presentations over 3 hours, 10 minutes each, no breaks. People can come and go as you wish. So if you have nothing to do this afternoon, you're more than welcome to join that experiment. And then from 4 p.m., Vinterfesten takes place. There'll be music, food, drinks, and a futures path. 5-step that begins with a fire to which you can throw the things that you want to leave behind. And then the rest will follow. In this series of Foresight and Futures, there's already 2 more things booked. We're super excited to have Krishna Gomez on January 20th, and even more so perhaps our idol Scott Smith and Susan Cox-Smith will be here in March. Their books are available in the pop-out over there for the Futures Library. And I also want to remind you that we're always looking for the books that we don't currently have in the library, and please recommend those and take a moment in the library on your way out. There's also one class booked for the spring already that is us teaching collaborative foresight. Some few seats left for that, and then just follow the program for more throughout the year. Thank you so much for being here. Have a good rest of your day.